They all believed the Korean Mafia boss had finally lost his mind. Some whispered it was jealousy. Others insisted it was obsession. But not a single person inside that towering glass headquarters knew they were about to witness a lesson that would change the meaning of respect forever. The executive conference room overlooked downtown Chicago, its floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the gray morning sky while silence settled over a table surrounded by men who had negotiated billion-dollar deals without ever raising their voices. Every seat was filled except one. Ethan Castellano stood at the head of the room, perfectly composed in a tailored charcoal suit, his hands resting lightly on the polished walnut table. His calm expression was somehow more intimidating than anger ever could be. No one interrupted him. No one even shifted in their chair. Behind him, the elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Olivia Carter stepped inside carrying a leather portfolio against her chest. She was 28, noticeably curvy, dressed in a simple navy business suit that fit comfortably rather than fashionably, with neatly braided hair pulled over one shoulder. She kept her eyes on the schedule in her hands instead of the room filled with executives. Olivia had worked as Ethan's assistant for almost 11 months, yet most people barely acknowledged her existence unless they needed coffee, documents, or a meeting confirmed. Some quietly joked that she looked more like someone's friendly neighbor than the assistant to one of the most powerful men in the city. She never answered those comments. She simply smiled, completed her work, and disappeared into the background again. Ethan waited until she placed the portfolio beside him before speaking. "Olivia, thank you. You may return to your office." She nodded politely. "Yes, sir." The door closed behind her. Ethan remained silent for several long seconds, allowing every curious glance to settle on him before delivering a sentence that instantly changed the atmosphere inside the room. Effective immediately, no man employed by this organization is permitted to initiate conversation with Miss Carter unless I personally authorize it. Several executives blinked in disbelief. One nearly dropped his pen. Another exchanged a confused look with the security director sitting across the table. Ethan continued as though he had merely announced a change to the lunch schedule. "The policy applies to executives, accountants, attorneys, drivers, security personnel, maintenance staff, and contractors. There will be no exceptions." The room stayed perfectly still. Finally, one senior manager cleared his throat carefully. "Sir, may we ask why?" Ethan looked directly at him, his expression unreadable. "No." That single word ended the discussion before it truly began. He gathered his notes, adjusted the cuff of his jacket, and walked toward the door with the same measured confidence he carried into every negotiation. Behind him, silence lasted only until the elevator doors closed. Then whispers spread through the room like a sudden change in weather. Some assumed Ethan had developed feelings for his assistant. Others insisted he had become irrationally possessive. A few laughed quietly, convinced the entire policy would disappear within days. No one considered there might be another explanation because the obvious answer always feels easier than the truthful one. Down the hallway, Olivia quietly organized the afternoon schedule without noticing the curious eyes now following every step she took. She believed it would be another ordinary workday. She had no idea that one sentence, spoken behind a closed conference room door, had already transformed her into the center of every conversation she was never meant to hear. By lunchtime, the new policy had traveled farther than any official announcement ever could. It moved through executive offices, security checkpoints, private garages, and employee lounges, growing stranger each time someone repeated it. Every version sounded more unbelievable than the last. Some insisted Ethan had forbidden anyone from even looking at Olivia for too long. Others claimed she had uncovered a dangerous secret and was now under constant protection. The most popular theory, however, spread because it required the least imagination. People convinced themselves that Ethan had become emotionally attached to his assistant and simply did not want another man near her. The rumors multiplied faster than facts ever could. Olivia remained completely unaware. Her office sat just outside Ethan's private suite, separated by frosted glass walls that softened the afternoon sunlight into a calm glow. She answered phone calls with the same warm professionalism she had shown since her first day, confirmed appointments, organized travel schedules, and reviewed contracts that required signatures before sunset. She greeted every employee with the same polite smile, even when many suddenly lowered their eyes and hurried past without saying a single word. At first, she assumed everyone was simply busy. Then the silence became impossible to ignore. When she entered the break room to refill her coffee mug, two accountants immediately stopped talking and quietly left. A maintenance supervisor who normally wished her a pleasant afternoon suddenly pretended to study his phone until she walked away. Even the security officers stationed near the elevators nodded awkwardly instead of exchanging their usual friendly greetings. Olivia stood alone beside the coffee machine for several seconds, wondering whether she had accidentally offended someone without realizing it. She replayed the previous week in her mind but found nothing unusual. She had met every deadline, solved scheduling conflicts, stayed late whenever Ethan needed support, and thanked everyone who had helped her. None of it explained why the building suddenly felt colder than before. Across the hallway, the whispers never truly stopped. Employees waited until she disappeared around a corner before exchanging amused looks. One young financial analyst quietly laughed that Ethan must have mistaken a corporate office for a royal palace. Another suggested Olivia had somehow manipulated the boss without anyone noticing. Someone else commented that it made no sense because she was not the glamorous woman people usually imagine standing beside a powerful executive. Those words were spoken softly enough that Olivia never heard them, but they revealed far more about the speakers than about her. Late that afternoon, a newly hired security officer named Mason Reed arrived for orientation. Formerly a deputy with the county sheriff's department, Mason believed rules existed for practical reasons, not mysterious ones. As he received his assignment, another guard quietly warned him about the unusual restriction concerning Ethan's assistant. Mason frowned. "So I cannot even introduce myself?" The older guard shrugged. "You can if you want your career to end before it starts." Mason glanced through the glass corridor and noticed Olivia carrying several neatly organized folders toward the executive conference room. She walked with quiet confidence, never asking for attention and never expecting anyone to move aside for her. There was nothing dramatic about her presence. She simply looked like a hardworking professional doing everything possible to make everyone else's day easier. Mason watched as three employees stepped aside without speaking, creating an uncomfortable silence around her that she seemed to accept without complaint. He had seen fear before. He had seen arrogance too. What he had never seen was a woman becoming isolated by a rule that nobody seemed willing to question. For the first time since joining the organization, Mason found himself wondering whether the strangest policy in the building had nothing to do with control and everything to do with a story no one had bothered to understand. The following morning, the invisible wall around Olivia had become impossible to ignore. It was no longer just an unusual policy whispered about behind closed doors. It had become part of the building itself, changing the way people moved through hallways, entered elevators, and even waited for coffee. Men who had once greeted her with casual smiles now stepped aside without saying a word. Some looked uncomfortable. Others appeared amused, as though they were participating in a joke that only everyone except Olivia understood. She continued her routine with remarkable grace, organizing Ethan's calendar down to the minute, reviewing travel confirmations, preparing meeting packets, and quietly solving problems before anyone else realized they existed. Every document arrived exactly where it needed to be. Every appointment began on time. Every client received a professional welcome. Yet the better she performed her job, the more isolated she seemed to become. Shortly before noon, Olivia carried several presentation folders toward the executive boardroom. As she rounded the corner, one folder slipped from the stack and scattered papers across the polished marble floor. Instinctively, three men walking nearby started to help. Their hands barely moved before they froze. Each remembered Ethan's order at exactly the same moment. They exchanged uneasy glances, hesitated, then awkwardly stepped backward. Olivia knelt alone, gathering page after page while pretending not to notice the uncomfortable silence surrounding her. She smiled softly anyway. "It is all right," she whispered to herself. "I have it." Mason Reed witnessed the entire scene from the security station across the lobby. Every instinct developed during years of public service told him to walk over and help. A folder on the floor was not a security concern. It was simple human decency. Yet every experienced employee remained perfectly still, watching an innocent woman struggle with papers because they feared violating a rule they did not understand. Mason tightened his jaw but stayed where he was. It was his third day. He needed answers before he challenged anything. Later that afternoon, Ethan crossed the executive floor after returning from a private meeting downtown. His pace never changed, but his eyes quietly observed everything around him. He noticed Olivia carrying 2 heavy archive boxes toward the records room. He noticed employees deliberately looking away as she passed. He noticed the growing distance that now followed her everywhere. His expression revealed nothing. He simply asked for the quarterly financial reports and continued into his office as though the day had unfolded exactly as expected. Behind closed doors, however, he stood silently beside the window overlooking the city. Reflected in the glass was not the skyline but Olivia returning to her desk alone, carefully rubbing her shoulder after carrying the weight herself. Ethan closed his eyes for one brief moment before opening them again. Whatever burden he carried remained locked behind the same calm expression the organization knew so well. Outside his office, Olivia quietly resumed answering emails with the same kindness she offered every person who contacted her. She never complained. She never questioned why familiar greetings had disappeared. She simply believed people had become busy. Mason no longer believed that explanation. The more he observed Olivia, the less she resembled the ambitious manipulator described by office gossip. She thanked the cleaning staff by name, smiled at receptionists, and quietly left homemade cookies at the front desk every Friday without signing the note. Nothing about her behavior matched the rumors. As the office lights reflected against the evening windows and another workday drew to a close, Mason realized the greatest mystery inside the building was no longer Ethan's order. It was why a woman who treated everyone with quiet respect had somehow become the loneliest person in the entire organization. The tension inside the headquarters reached a breaking point on Friday morning, not because anyone openly challenged Ethan's authority, but because curiosity had finally become stronger than patience. Every unanswered question created another rumor, and every rumor pushed employees further away from the truth. Mason Reed noticed it during every security round. Conversation stopped the moment Olivia entered a hallway. Laughter disappeared when she approached the front desk. Even visiting clients sensed the unusual atmosphere, although none of them could explain why the executive floor felt strangely quiet whenever Ethan's assistant appeared. Olivia continued carrying herself with the same calm professionalism that had earned Ethan's trust months earlier. She reviewed contracts, arranged conference calls across multiple time zones, coordinated travel schedules, and quietly corrected mistakes before anyone else discovered them. She never asked why people avoided speaking to her. Instead, she assumed everyone was respecting a decision that she herself did not fully understand. That assumption made Mason admire her even more. Most people would have demanded explanations or allowed frustration to show. Olivia simply focused on her work. Shortly after 2 o'clock that afternoon, an unexpected delivery arrived for Ethan. The courier required an immediate signature before releasing several confidential documents. Olivia walked toward the reception area carrying the authorization forms, but the courier, unfamiliar with the company's unusual policy, greeted her naturally. "Excuse me, ma'am. Could you help me verify this address?" Before Olivia could answer, a senior operations manager named Daniel Foster stepped between them. "I will take care of it," he said quickly, gently guiding the courier aside before another word could be exchanged. The confused visitor apologized, believing he had interrupted an important meeting. Olivia simply smiled politely and returned to her desk without saying anything. Mason watched the entire exchange through the security monitors. The situation looked harmless, almost absurd, yet everyone nearby behaved as though a simple conversation had become dangerous. Minutes later, Daniel received a message requesting his immediate presence in Ethan's office. Several executives quietly exchanged knowing glances. 10 minutes passed. 15. When Daniel finally emerged, his expression had completely changed. He was not angry. He was not embarrassed. He simply looked thoughtful, carrying a sealed envelope and silently collecting a few personal belongings from his office. Word spread quickly that he had been placed on administrative leave pending reassignment to another division outside headquarters. No public explanation followed. Ethan offered none. The policy remained exactly as it had been announced. By the end of the afternoon, every remaining employee understood that Ethan's instruction was not symbolic. It would be enforced without exception. The rumors immediately grew louder than before. Some insisted Ethan had become irrationally overprotective. Others argued that absolute power had finally clouded his judgment. Mason listened without participating. None of the theories explained one detail he could not ignore. Every time Ethan happened to pass Olivia in the hallway, he never lingered, never acted possessively, and never treated her differently from any trusted executive assistant. He simply acknowledged her work with quiet professionalism before continuing toward his next meeting. There was no hidden romance in his eyes. There was only constant awareness, as though he were silently measuring every room she entered. That evening, as the city lights reflected across the glass walls of the headquarters, Mason reviewed hours of security footage for routine documentation. Again and again, he noticed the same pattern. Ethan rarely watched the people speaking. He watched the people watching Olivia. Whatever secret everyone believed surrounded her, Mason became increasingly certain they had been asking the wrong question from the very beginning. The mystery was never why Ethan had created the rule. The real mystery was what Ethan had already seen that no one else had even noticed. Monday arrived beneath a steady spring rain that painted the windows with soft gray reflections, but inside the headquarters the atmosphere felt even heavier than the weather outside. Mason Reed had spent the entire weekend replaying every unusual moment he had witnessed since joining the organization. None of it made sense. Ethan never displayed the possessiveness everyone assumed. Olivia never behaved like someone hiding influence or seeking special treatment. If anything, she seemed determined to remain invisible. That contradiction refused to leave Mason's mind. Shortly after 8 o'clock, he reported for duty earlier than usual and began reviewing employee access logs as part of his routine responsibilities. One detail immediately caught his attention. Olivia almost always entered the building before sunrise and left well after most executives had gone home. Her schedule was remarkably consistent, yet she never billed overtime or requested additional compensation. Curious rather than suspicious, Mason asked the overnight receptionist whether Olivia had always worked those long hours. The receptionist smiled warmly. Every day. She says preparing everything before the office gets busy makes everyone else's day easier. The answer surprised him. It sounded exactly like the woman he had quietly observed, not the person described by office gossip. Later that morning, Mason noticed Olivia carrying a small paper bag as she walked through the employee lounge. She quietly placed fresh muffins beside the coffee station with a handwritten note that simply read, "Please enjoy. Have a wonderful Monday." She walked away before anyone could see her. 10 minutes later, employees happily ate the pastries while continuing to speculate about her behind closed doors, never realizing who had paid for their breakfast. Mason watched the irony unfold without saying a word. During lunch, he found himself assigned to the executive floor outside Ethan's office. The hallway remained unusually quiet until Olivia approached carrying a stack of neatly organized folders. As she reached Ethan's doorway, he opened it before she could knock. "Good afternoon, Olivia." "Good afternoon, sir. Your revised schedule and the Charity Foundation reports." Ethan accepted the folders with a brief nod. "Thank you. Did you remember your appointment this evening?" Olivia smiled politely. "Yes, sir. I will leave 30 minutes early, just as you reminded me." "Good. Do not miss it." "I will not." The conversation lasted less than 20 seconds, yet something about it stayed with Mason long after Olivia disappeared around the corner. There had been no personal familiarity, no hidden affection, no favoritism. Instead, Ethan had spoken with the calm attentiveness of someone making certain an important commitment was not forgotten. That evening, as Olivia prepared to leave, Mason noticed she carried no shopping bags, no gym clothes, and no social plans written in her calendar. Instead, she drove across town to a modest medical office located near a quiet neighborhood park. Remaining inside the boundaries of his security assignment, Mason simply observed from a respectful distance until he recognized the sign outside the building. It belonged to a licensed counseling and wellness center. Olivia entered alone and remained inside for nearly an hour before leaving with the same gentle expression she always wore at work. She did not appear distressed. She looked relieved, as though she had completed an important promise to herself. Mason returned to headquarters carrying more questions than answers. Whatever brought Olivia to that office every month clearly mattered to Ethan as well. Yet if her private appointments were connected to his extraordinary rule, then the truth was far more serious than office gossip had ever imagined. For the first time, Mason stopped searching for evidence that Ethan was wrong. Instead, he began wondering how much Olivia had endured before anyone finally chose to protect her. The answer arrived on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, not through a dramatic confession or a secret conversation, but through a simple file that had been left unattended for less than 30 seconds. Mason had been assigned to escort a technology consultant through the executive floor while a conference room was being prepared. As they passed the reception area, Olivia received an urgent call from Ethan asking her to bring several financial reports upstairs immediately. She apologized to the consultant, carefully placed a sealed folder on her desk, and hurried toward the private elevator. A few moments later, a gust of air from the opening elevator doors lifted one sheet of paper from beneath the folder. It drifted gently onto the polished floor. Mason instinctively stepped forward to prevent anyone from accidentally stepping on it. He bent down, intending only to return the page without reading it. Yet before he could look away, a single heading caught his attention. It was not a corporate document. It belonged to the counseling center he had seen earlier that week. He immediately lowered his eyes out of respect, but one sentence had already registered in his mind. The document referenced ongoing treatment for anxiety related to past traumatic experiences and recommended maintaining carefully structured workplace boundaries to support emotional recovery. Before Mason could think another thought, Olivia returned. Embarrassed, he handed the page back without asking a single question. She accepted it with a grateful smile, unaware that he had seen even a fraction of its contents. "Thank you," she said softly. "The air conditioning has a habit of stealing papers." Mason simply nodded. "You are welcome." She gathered the documents and quietly slipped the page back into the folder before disappearing into Ethan's office. For the rest of the afternoon, Mason could no longer hear the rumors the same way. Every careless joke now felt painfully misplaced. Every assumption suddenly seemed built upon complete ignorance. The organization had spent days inventing stories about jealousy, favoritism, and control while the truth appeared to be something entirely different. Ethan had never asked anyone to admire his decision. He had never attempted to defend it. He had simply accepted being misunderstood. Later that evening, Mason remained in the security office reviewing routine camera feeds when he noticed Ethan leaving his office after nearly everyone else had gone home. Instead of heading directly toward the private garage, Ethan stopped outside Olivia's empty desk. There was nothing sentimental about the moment. He quietly straightened a stack of folders that had shifted during the day, noticed her water bottle had been left behind, and placed it inside the office refrigerator with a small handwritten reminder attached that read, "Do not forget this tomorrow." Then he turned off the lights and walked away without another glance. Mason watched the monitor in silence. It was the smallest gesture imaginable, yet it revealed more character than all the rumors combined. Protection did not always announce itself through dramatic speeches. Sometimes it appeared in ordinary acts that no one else was meant to see. As Mason shut down the final security screen before ending his shift, one realization settled heavily in his mind. Olivia had never been surrounded by special treatment. She had been surrounded by carefully constructed safeguards. The only people who had mistaken compassion for possession were those who had never bothered to ask why someone as powerful as Ethan was willing to let an entire organization misunderstand him in order to quietly protect the dignity of one person. The following Friday, every executive received an unexpected calendar invitation marked mandatory. No agenda accompanied it. No explanation appeared beneath the meeting title. By 9 o'clock that morning, the largest conference room inside headquarters was filled with department heads, senior managers, legal advisors, and security supervisors. The atmosphere carried the weight of unanswered questions that had been building for weeks. Ethan entered precisely on time and quietly took his place at the front of the room. Olivia was not beside him. For the first time since many employees could remember, her desk outside his office remained empty. Ethan allowed the silence to settle before speaking. "Today, I am ending the speculation." No one interrupted him. Several people exchanged uncertain glances, sensing that whatever came next would finally explain the decision that had divided the organization. Ethan reached for a small remote and activated the presentation screen behind him. Instead of financial reports or business projections, a single sentence appeared. "Respecting privacy is not optional. It is leadership." The room remained perfectly still. Ethan continued in the same calm voice that never required volume to command attention. "Many of you believed my decision was personal. Many of you assumed it reflected favoritism. Some of you openly questioned my judgment. None of you asked the one person most affected by your assumptions how she was doing." His words landed more heavily than anyone expected. He changed to the next slide. It contained no private medical details, no confidential records, and no personal history. Instead, it displayed a formal workplace accommodation plan approved by legal counsel and supported by licensed healthcare professionals. The document explained that certain workplace boundaries had been recommended to support an employee's continued recovery after difficult experiences outside the workplace. Personal details had been intentionally removed to protect her dignity, but the purpose of the policy could not have been clearer. Ethan looked across the room. Miss Carter never requested special treatment. She requested the opportunity to do her job with professionalism while following recommendations that supported her continued progress. "I approved those recommendations because protecting the well-being of my employees is part of my responsibility." No one spoke. The executives who had quietly laughed only days earlier lowered their eyes toward the conference table. Ethan continued. "She has never asked for sympathy. She has never used her circumstances for personal advantage. She arrives before most of you. She leaves after most of you. She solves problems before they reach your desks. Yet many of you rewarded that dedication with gossip." The silence became almost unbearable. Mason stood near the back of the room as part of the security detail, watching faces change one by one. The confidence that had fueled so many rumors quietly disappeared. Ethan took one final step away from the screen. Compassion does not always require public explanation. Sometimes leadership means accepting criticism rather than exposing another person's private story. At that exact moment, the conference room door opened gently. Olivia entered carrying several folders, unaware that every eye had turned toward her. She smiled politely, placed the documents beside Ethan, and apologized for arriving a minute later than expected because the elevator had been delayed. Ethan thanked her exactly as he always did. Nothing more. Nothing less. Olivia quietly left the room without realizing she had just become the reason dozens of people were confronting their own assumptions. After the door closed, no one rushed to defend their earlier opinions. No one searched for excuses. The room remained completely silent because the truth had accomplished what authority alone never could. It had forced every person present to recognize that the greatest mistake had never been Ethan's policy. It had been judging someone whose quiet strength they had never taken the time to understand. When the meeting finally ended, no one hurried toward the elevators the way they usually did after executive briefings. Small conversations that normally filled the hallways never began. Instead, people walked quietly back to their offices, carrying something much heavier than folders or laptops. They carried the uncomfortable realization that they had created an image of Olivia without ever truly knowing her. Ethan offered no victory speech and accepted no apologies in the conference room. He simply returned to work as though the most important lesson of the week required no celebration. Outside his office, Olivia was organizing travel arrangements for the following month, completely unaware that the atmosphere around her had shifted in ways she could not yet see. The first sign appeared just before noon. One of the receptionists approached her desk with a small potted plant decorated with a handwritten card. It contained only 4 simple words. "Thank you for everything." There was no signature. Olivia looked around the office, confused, but no one claimed responsibility. She smiled softly, placed the plant beside her computer monitor, and returned to answering emails. An hour later, another quiet gesture followed. The accounting department delivered fresh pastries for the executive floor with a note thanking everyone for another successful quarter. This time, someone had intentionally placed Olivia's favorite blueberry muffin on a separate plate before anyone else arrived. Again, no explanation was offered. Throughout the afternoon, the changes continued. Employees who had once stepped aside in uncomfortable silence now acknowledged her with warm smiles. Because Ethan's workplace accommodation remained in effect, the men still respected the professional boundary that had been established, but their silence no longer carried awkwardness or judgment. It carried understanding. The women in the office began including Olivia in casual conversations during breaks, asking about recipes, community events, and weekend plans. For the first time in weeks, laughter returned to the executive floor, and none of it came at Olivia's expense. Mason watched the transformation with quiet satisfaction. He realized that Ethan had accomplished something few leaders ever managed to achieve. He had not forced respect through fear or punishment. He had simply revealed enough truth to allow people to confront their own assumptions. Late that afternoon, Daniel Foster returned to headquarters after completing meetings at another company location. Instead of walking directly to his office, he paused outside Olivia's desk. He remained several feet away, carefully honoring the workplace boundary, and spoke in a calm, respectful voice. "Miss Carter, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about you that were unfair. I am sorry." Olivia looked genuinely surprised. She searched his face as though trying to remember what he was referring to before offering the same gentle smile she had always given everyone else. "Thank you, Mr. Foster. I appreciate your kindness." There was no bitterness in her voice. No desire to embarrass him. She accepted his apology with a grace that made several nearby employees lower their eyes once again, this time because they recognized how much dignity she had carried even while others had failed to offer her the same respect. As the workday came to an end, Ethan stepped out of his office and noticed the small plant beside Olivia's computer. He glanced toward the reception desk, where a few employees quietly smiled before returning to their work. Ethan understood immediately what had happened. Without saying a word, he looked at Olivia. She looked happier than she had in weeks, although she could not explain why the building suddenly felt warmer than before. Ethan simply nodded once, gathered his briefcase, and walked toward the elevator. Sometimes the strongest form of justice arrived without applause. Sometimes it appeared in ordinary people choosing to become better than they had been the day before. Several months later, the unusual policy no longer defined the organization. The rumors had faded, the whispers had disappeared, and the story people remembered was no longer about restrictions but about the quiet responsibility that came with leadership. Life inside headquarters had settled into a new rhythm. Employees greeted one another with greater patience, meetings felt less hurried, and small acts of consideration had become part of the culture without anyone announcing a new corporate initiative. Olivia remained exactly who she had always been. She still arrived before sunrise with neatly organized schedules waiting on every executive desk. She still remembered birthdays, quietly arranged charitable events, and noticed the smallest details that helped everyone else succeed. The difference was not in Olivia. The difference was in the people around her. They finally saw the woman who had been standing in front of them all along. One crisp autumn morning, the company hosted a community scholarship breakfast for local high school students. Volunteers from every department gathered in the lobby before sunrise, arranging tables, welcoming families, and preparing gift bags. Mason stood near the entrance providing security while watching employees work together with genuine enthusiasm. As the first guests arrived, he noticed something that made him smile. Without discussing it, several employees naturally formed a respectful path through the crowded lobby so Olivia could move comfortably between registration tables carrying supplies. No one had been instructed to do it. No policy required it. It had simply become second nature to think about someone else's comfort before their own convenience. Ethan observed the same moment from the second-floor balcony overlooking the lobby. He said nothing. He did not need to. The lesson he had hoped the organization would eventually learn had finally taken root on its own. Later that morning, the scholarship recipients gathered for a group photograph. One young student nervously approached Olivia and thanked her for helping calm his anxious mother before the ceremony began. "You made today easier for her," he said with a grateful smile. Olivia looked surprised. "I only listened." The student nodded. "Sometimes that is exactly what people need." Ethan happened to hear those words as he walked past. For a brief moment, he looked toward Mason, who quietly returned a respectful nod. Neither man spoke because both understood that the greatest victories rarely appeared in financial reports or public recognition. They appeared when kindness quietly inspired more kindness. As the event came to an end, employees gathered near the entrance while families made their way home carrying scholarship certificates and hopeful smiles. Olivia stood beside the reception desk watching the last guests leave beneath the warm afternoon sunlight streaming through the glass doors. For the first time since she had joined the organization, she did not feel invisible. She did not feel judged. She simply felt accepted. Ethan paused beside the doorway before leaving for his next meeting. In his calm, steady voice, he spoke words that everyone nearby happened to hear. Power earns attention. Character earns trust. Never confuse the two. No one answered because no answer was necessary. The silence that followed was no longer uncomfortable. It was peaceful. Every person standing there understood that genuine strength had never been measured by authority, titles, or influence. It had been measured by the willingness to protect another person's dignity even when doing so invited misunderstanding. And on that ordinary afternoon, inside a building once filled with careless assumptions, everyone finally remembered what dignity truly looked like.